Hi, my name is Franklin Joyce. This is my final video project for Philosophy of Mind. And basically, I'm just going to be working through three different aspects from primary sources that we've read throughout this semester. Forgive me if I yawn or look otherwise dazed. I'm running on very little sleep for this complex of mental cognition, but we will get along as best we can. So the first aspect, or the first primary source that I want to talk about is Amy Kind's book, Philosophy of Mind, the Basics, which is more or less just kind of a very perfunctory textbook that's just really going over some of the basic theories and ideas within philosophy of mind. A specific argument that drew my attention, both when we engaged with it in class and as I was looking back over, was the zombie argument, which, zombies, duh, like that's just hilarious. So, what is the zombie argument? Basically, the zombie argument is that we can conceive of a human being, like we can conceive of a person that's physically identical to me and you, but that person lacks any qualitative experience. So, in order to understand that, you'll need to understand what qualitative experiences are. So, qualitative experience is something like a sensation, or an expression of what it feels to be something or what it feels to have something. So, for instance, pain is a qualitative experience. We could say that like some types of pleasure are qualitative experience. But a qualitative experience is like what it feels like to something, to have something, to be something, or experience something. And so it seems conceivable, as so the zombie argument goes, that we can have two physically identical organisms, one of which has qualitative experiences and one of which does not. The organism without qualitative experiences is the zombie, and the other organism could be, a regular human being such as myself. So the idea is that, this identical organism, the zombie that lacks qualitative experience, would respond in every single way to any kind of stimulus as I would. It's a physically identical organism. So if you stabbed it with a pin, um, the zombie would respond, that hurt, that there was pain. But the zombie wouldn't actually have the experience. It wouldn't actually have the qualitative experience of feeling pain, whereas I, as a human being, would have the qualitative experience of feeling pain. So the argument goes that there must then be something else besides just the physical um, molecules that make up me as an organism that produces or allows me to have this type of qualitative experience. And from that kind of assumption, what most philosophers will then do is say that, well, this calls for some type of dualism, whether it be substance dualism or property dualism. But basically, the idea is that there is such a thing as the soul or such a thing as the mind that are in some way immaterial. They're some way like disconnected from my physical. They're connected to my physical body, but they're of a different, either of a different substance or they're kind of a different property than what my body, like my physical body is. And so this argument is used to support a dualist outlook or a dualist theory of the mind. The problem that I see with this is, first off, as we've discussed before in class, arguments from conceivability already seem to be on pretty shaky logical ground. I mean, it doesn't seem to necessarily follow that I can conceive of something while I can conceive of something, and we can say, well, yes, that conception is logically, it's not a logical contradiction. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that because I can conceive of something, it's an actual thing, like it's an actual occurrence. So, but even then, I think this argument, we don't even have to worry. We can grant the fact that, we can even grant that, okay, just because it's a conceivability argument, I'll let you keep it. I'm not going to throw it out because of that. But I don't think that it's actually, I don't accept the premise that it's conceivable that we can have a zombie, that there can be a human being that is physically identical to me and yet not have qualitative experiences. So the dualist would argue that, yeah, you poke the pin in the zombie, it's going to say, ow, that hurts. Like it's going to respond in the way I would respond. but doesn't have qualitative experience, to me it just seems like that's like what you're begging a bigger mystery than the physicalist is by not being able to correctly ascribe qualitative experiences to an exact mechanical physical process. If you're saying that, oh no, it's possible to have two physically identical beings, that one of which just lacks some experience that another one has. Like that just doesn't seem to make sense. If you have two physically identical beings and they undergo the same physical process, then it in all of our experience, it seems to be the case that they would experience the same response. So I'm not sure that I'm actually going to accept that it's even conceivable that we can have a physically identical being to a human being that doesn't experience qualitative, like doesn't undergo qualitative experience. It seems that if I grant that, then I'm just begging substance dualism. I'm already rejecting physicalism, without any evidence to do so, just because you asked me to do it in your premise. And while I'm a nice guy, I'm not a nice philosopher, and I'm not going to give you what you're asking in my premises unless I want to. So, you can screw off. So that's the argument that I want to talk about from Mekind. Again, I just like zombies. So moving from that, I wanted to talk about Peter Godfrey Smith's book, Other Minds, which I thought was really fantastic. Very interesting look at like the develop, not only at the minds of octopi and cephalopods, but also he's tracking throughout this book the two different developments of the mind: the development of the mind within us, within human beings, but also the development of the mind within cephalopods, which he thinks is kind of occurs on two different evolutionary tracks. So the chapter that I wanted to talk about was called Our Minds and Others. And what I wanted to specifically kind of focus in on is PGS is tracking the development of language and the development of the interaction that language has with our own internal thought. And so in the very, kind of as the evolutionary theory is beginning to be espoused, there's this idea that language is the precursor of internal thought. That language arises first, and then after language has arisen, after organisms have fairly complex language, they begin to kind of internalize that language. PGS brings up like the classic example of David Hume, who if you kind of look within yourself, you undergo not menstrual. Good Lord, I'm tired. If you go through mental introspection, you just there's thoughts, there's language, there's a flow of words that's occurring within yourself, or at least within myself. I don't know what you're thinking about. It's probably not words. I'm not gonna say anything more. But Darwin has the quote that says, "A long and complex train of thought can no more be carried on without the aids of words, whether spoken or silenced, than a long calculation without the use of very complex figures or algebra." So Darwin thinks that, or thought, that we had to have spoken word, you had to have spoken language before you could have any type of internal thought. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Like we see animals, PGS brings up the example of baboons. There's been studies done with chimpanzees who are able to undergo pretty highly complex mental activity, like pretty high order, or not high order, but like fairly complex thought without a real spoken language, without being able to, speak. And so it doesn't seem to be the case to say that internal dialogue or internal thought only arises in the presence of language. And so, but at the same time, it seems that language is a very important aspect. It seems to be kind of integral in some ways to internal thought, at least in us as human beings. So PGS is trying to figure out where this paradox arises. He's trying to rectify this situation where we have examples of organisms that seem to display high or very complex thought, but have no language. But to us, it seems like if you disconnect language from our mental processes, what would that even look like? And so PGS says that language is an important tool for thought and inner speech, is not mere mental acoustic froth. So like our inner dialogue is not just, you know, junk basically. But it is not essential to the organization of ideas, and language is not the medium of complex thought. So, you know, again, is expressing this paradox of where language seems to us to be kind of all important for complex thought, but it's not required. He brings up the example of a French priest that, you know, undergoes these apoplectic seizures. Is, you know, he can't actually like linguistically process or speak, but yet he's still able to have like self-awareness. He's still able to, you know, perform, you know, cognitively. So PGS talks about this Russian researcher called Vygotsky, who actually proposed, you know, that the to mediate this paradox, you have to kind of meet in the middle. So Vygotsky proposed that it wasn't the fact that you have to have spoken language in order to develop complex thought, but rather that the explosion of complex thought seen in the human species was a direct effect of an internalization of language. So the idea is that when language, like when you develop language and then you begin to internalize that language so that your brain is kind of using words, so to speak, begins to work in linguistic terms, all of a sudden there's an explosion in what you're able to do. You're suddenly able to communicate with yourself much better. PGS describes this as like the second big evolutionary internalization. And he says that if inner speech is a kind of broadcasting of information in the brain, it resembles the loop of reafference seen when you talk aloud to yourself or write notes to yourself. But this time the loop is tighter and more confined, invisible rather than public, a field for free and silent experiment. So what PGS is imagining here is just in the way that I would, you know, write down what I want to say. Like I write notes to myself to remind myself, like basically a thought to remind myself some part of my own memory, some part of my own mental projections or activity. Basically, that process is just kind of biologically expressed within my brain. And so what's happened within the evolutionary process is that language has been internalized. Language has been, for us as a species, language has been kind of just integrated into our brain. And it's because of that occurrence that we are able to cognitively operate at such a high level that we're able to, you know, do philosophy and be engineers and, you know, so on and so forth, because we are able to more or less undergo this very tight constant reafference loop within our own selves, of which we are, you know, all of our thoughts are being expressed linguistically, and so we're able to manipulate thoughts. We're able to manipulate, you know, projections of reality. We're able to manipulate problems within our own minds without actually, you know, experiencing them, and we can do that linguistically. And so that's PGS's argument, is that whereas the cephalopods are gonna, they obviously by their nature are, you know, their minds are evolving on a different kind of evolutionary track than what we are. The explosion, one of the main reasons perhaps of the higher cognitive function of human beings, is the fact that we have been able to internalize our language, or able to internalize linguistics. And then for my last primary source that I want to talk about, I just wanted to talk about one of my favorite stories, probably my favorite story that we read, for the semester, which was Truth of Fact and Feeling by Ted Chiang, not Terry Chiang. And this story is the one in which Chiang is talking about, there's two kind of separate storylines that are being developed at the same time. One in which a journalist is kind of writing an article about ReMem, this kind of like a microchip you get installed, or like contacts that you put in that records everything, everything you see, it's recording. And then you can, you know, go back and watch these, and kind of the journey this journalist undergoes as he realizes that in many ways his memories of the past are not very true to what actually happened. At the same time that that's happening, Chiang was also telling the story of a scribe, or a young boy in a colonized African tribe who learns to write, and, you know, his kind of struggle with, you know, what this means for him, what this means for his community. And I made a claim in my journal that a lot of people kind of went up against hard in class, and I didn't get to defend myself because I was in quarantine. So this is kind of my comeback at all of those people who were going after my view. But I made the claim that in relation to ourselves as subjective beings, truth is in a sense always subjective. So Chang talks about within his story, there's two types of truth. This truth is like corresponding to fact, and then truth is an expression of our experience. And I think he definitely hits on something here. There seems to be, like I can say, you could conduct, a scientific experiment, say, you can measure the speed at which something falls when pulled by gravity, and say that it's true that it's going to fall at 9.82 meters a second or whatever, and that's something that corresponds to what is. It just corresponds to what has happened, or it corresponds to reality. But at the same time, I'm a subjective being. Everything, all my entire understanding of reality is filtered through, in a sense, a not really reliable method. Like my memories are pretty flawed. Even the way that I experience things, my experience of a brick falling off a building and hitting someone in the head is going to be very different from someone else's. Like the person who got hit by the brick falling off the building and hitting their head, there's going to be a very different subjective experience of that reality for me than from the person that got hit in the head. So my argument is that while we can have truth that corresponds, like this kind of factual, objective truth, that's all fine and good, but really, even that objective truth is going to be filtered through my subjective experience. And so the most that I can have is this type of subjective truth. And what I'm not saying, what people like kind of take that to mean is, well, I'm proposing relativism, that there is no truth, that kind of whatever I feel like or whatever I think is, that's true. Like whatever is true according to my experience is the case. And I don't want to espouse that, because there's lots of really bad moral implications that arise from espousing a relativist position. Rather, what I'm saying is that there's certain experiences, there's certain like things about the world that are true in the way that I experience them. I might watch that brick fall off the building and hit someone in the head, and I can say, this would be horrible, but I can say that it was true to my experience that was, a humorous occurrence. Whereas to the person that got hit in the head with the brick, not true. That wasn't funny at all for them, but it was true to me through my subjective experience that, that was humorous. I don't go around throwing bricks off of Y Camp and hitting people in the heads, just to clarify. But there seems to me that we have to, at the very least, expand what we mean when we say something is true, like expand what we mean by our definition of truth, given that we are inherently subjective individuals, that we are inherently subjective beings, and we are always, in a sense, going to kind of manipulate what we intake, what we know, what we understand from reality in a subjective way. And so I think that we have to develop, or we have to at least, begin a dialogue and try to figure out what it means for something to be true for us who are subjective creatures. That's all that I have. Of course, I'm quite a few minutes over time, as expected and as predicted. This has been a really fantastic class, and I've greatly enjoyed it. Go back to bed and kiss your wife.